So I'd like to welcome everyone to our tonight's Bannon Forum conversation with Dr. Thierry Meynard. My name is Aaron Willis, and I am the director of the Bannon Forum here in the Ignatian Center for Jesuit Education at Santa Clara University. Happy you could join us here, and this is the final of our 4 events on the Jesuits and interreligious dialogue in Asia. Our event tonight, which is co-sponsored by the Jesuit School of Theology and the Department of Religious Studies, speaks to the mission of Santa Clara as a Jesuit institution in important ways. It does so not just because it examines aspects of the Jesuits in China, but primarily because it focuses our attention on important traits of the Jesuit tradition. The most apparent in our context and really throughout this series is the importance of seeking new ways of understanding the world through scholarship, openness, and dialogue. The outcome of our contemporary understanding of dialogue is a greater possibility of human flourishing and new insights and possibilities for all. And so in light of this tradition of deep dialogue and critical scholarship, I'm delighted that we're able to end our series with Dr. Meynard and also Dr. Paul Mariani of the Department of History here at Santa Clara University. So I'll now hand it over to Dr. Thomas Cotoy, who is Associate Professor of Christology and Cultures and the Dwan Family Endowed Chair in Ecumenical and Interfaith Dialogue. And also briefly, I just want to thank him for really generating the idea for this series and helping us get to where we are with this 4th and final event. So thank you, Thomas, and I'll hand it over to you.
Yes, thank you, Aaron. So again, welcome everybody to this event. I'm going to just say a few words to introduce our main speaker, and then I will go into hiding until I come back to introduce our respondent. So Professor Thierry Meynard, a member of the Society of Jesus, was born in France in 1963. He is currently professor and a PhD director at the philosophy department of Yat-sen University in Guangzhou. He is a director of the Archive for the Introduction of Western Knowledge at the same university. And between 2012 and 2014, he was the director at the Beijing Center for Chinese Studies, which is also a study program established by the Society of Jesus. He completed his doctorate in philosophy at Beijing University, taught at Fordham University for a few years, and has authored a number of works in English. The Jesuit reading of Confucius and the religious philosophy of Liang Shuming, both for Brill, Confucius Sinarum Philosophus, and has co-authored 2 studies, one a brief introduction to the study of human nature by Giulio Aleni, and Jesuit Hreya in late Ming China. And I should add a personal note. I always remember with great fondness and gratitude Thierry's hospitality during my visit at Yat-sen University already quite a few years ago. I always hope I can go back at some point. So Thierry, the floor is yours.
Okay, I would like to share my screen. I don't know if you can see the screen now. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so first I would like to thank the Ignatian Center for Jesuit Education at Santa Clara University to welcome me to this forum. And my talk today will be about perhaps something very remote to you. I mean, the Canton Conference, Canton or Guangzhou in China in 1668, and about the Chinese Rite controversy. So we are going to focus in one specific moment within the Chinese Rite controversy. So I would like, my lecture will be into 5 parts. The first, I will talk about the background of this encounter between Christianity and China and the Canton Conference. And the second point will be about ritual to Confucius. And after I will talk about the question of eating vegetarian, and perhaps something which may be strange to you, and also something perhaps even stranger again, to wearing a hat. And so I will finish about a kind of conclusion about the theology of culture and religion and how to articulate Christianity with culture. So first about the encounter between Christianity and China. So we know that it started with Michele Ruggieri and Matteo Ricci in South China. And in fact, they devised this method of inculturation And so, in fact, they didn't start it by themselves. It already started in other parts of the world, and especially in Japan. But basically, there was a kind of a positive appreciation in China about Confucian culture, about Confucianism. Is to say that within Chinese culture, which is very broad, which encompasses many elements, they somehow select Confucianism as a main
It looks like we are experiencing some difficulties with our connection. Let's hope that Thierry can actually get back to us. Thierry, you're back? You were frozen.
Yes, I can hear you.
You were frozen for a minute. Okay, you can continue.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Okay, so I continue, but so that it was the first stage, I mean, in 1580s. A second stage in the 1620s, we have a kind of debates about the term for God. And so it was a big controversy and discussion like the name of God in Chinese language. In fact, it is an old question in any culture, how to translate the name of God. And so there was people advocating for a kind of new term called Tianzhu, but some, like people following Matteo Ricci, advocating for the use of Shangdi, which is a traditional term in China. And after that, in fact, we have to understand that the Jesuits were the only missionary group in China. And in the 1630s, the situation is changing because there is the arrival of Dominican and Franciscan coming from Philippines and arriving in the region of Fujian. And so they are somehow going to contest the Jesuit approach, and they are going to raise the issue about the kind of perception somehow went too far into adopting Chinese culture. And so here, I mean, it is a focus of my lecture is about Canton Conference. What happened is that between 1666 and 71, during 5 years, we have in Canton, in Guangzhou, more than 20 missionaries from 6 different countries, which are in Canton. And they are going to debate about missionary policies and about and we are going to do also to engage in a very important work, translating a Chinese text and the classics, but also books of medicine, a book of history into a Western language. And so we have this Canton Conference happening at that time. So the first and perhaps the most important topic of the debate is about the ritual to Confucius and also to the ancestor, and how to consider those rituals. Are they civil or political? They belong to the custom of China, and so in this way they are neutral. They can be accepted by Christianity, or the rituals to Confucius or to ancestor are paid to idols, idolatrous, and they should be rejected. They are going to focus on a specific ritual called the Jiding ritual, which is performed twice a year in the temple of Confucius in all the cities in China. And they are going to base the discussion about a book called Daming Huedian, which is a kind of legal documents which talk about the law in China and the rituals. And one of is very important is the Emperor Rongwu of the Ming Dynasty in the 26th year had a description of the ritual. So those are kind of normative documents to explain how the ritual should be performed. And what we have two missionaries who are going to research and to do analysis of those documents. One is a Dominican, Domingo Navarrete, from Spain, and the other is Francesco Brancati from Sicilia. And we are going to engage into analysis of these documents from different angles. So here I put a picture, is a picture of, which was in fact drawn in Europe around 1710. And in fact, it is a picture from the people opposing the ritual to Confucius. And what they want to depict into that picture, in fact, is the idea that the ritual to Confucius are performed to an idol. They're idolatrous. And so somehow, because in fact, we don't have in China this kind of setting with this kind of temples, and we see background. I mean, in terms of imaginary, it looks like more the temple of Jerusalem, where sometimes you will have people practicing idolatry, and so it is a kind of condemnation of this kind of rituals to Confucius. And here, I mean, we can have the picture, for example, Tom right, we have the selection of the pig, how the pig is going to be selected. And here, D, you can see the pig is going to be slaughtered, and we are going to collect the blood and the hair of the pig. And at the end also of the rituals, they are going to bury the blood of the pig and also the hair of the pig, because they cannot really be used. But at the end of the ritual also, they are going to give pieces of the pig to people so that they will consume the pork meat. And so part of the rituals, we have the master of ceremony. The master of ceremony is say, welcome the spirit. So we may imagine that the master of ceremony is here, number 3, or perhaps here, number E. And according to Navarrete, he understands that they uncover the meat of the sacrifice, and the master of ceremony say, may the spirit of Confucius come down. And then the sacrificer raises a cup of wine. So when you read these kind of things, in fact, immediately for people with a kind of a Catholic background, he will immediately see a connection with the Mass. And in fact, the word, may the spirit of Confucius come down, it sounds like the epiclesis, when the priest has the hand over the bread. And so there is a spirit of Christ, the bread, and become the body of Christ. And and there is the cup of wine. But Brancati, the Jesuit, in fact, understand that very differently. He say that, in fact, when the people say Inkshan, welcome the spirit, they do not really believe that the spirit of Confucius comes into that place or even into those offerings, but it is only a way to honor the tablet, because there is a tablet of Confucius which is outside of this place, and the tablet of Confucius is brought in. So we have to welcome the tablet, and the tablet is kind of holding the place of the defunct. And so it is not a real presence, but it is a symbolic presence. So it has nothing to do with the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. So that it is, but Navarrete say that many pagans or many Chinese literati believe that the people who receive the meat at the end of the sacrifice are going, when they eat the meat, they are going to make a progress in their degrees in examination, that they, to pass the exam. Cathy say, the participants do not ask anything to Confucius and only want to honor him. So that it is a big question when the people practice sacrifice to Confucius. Is it only a way to honor him, or there is a kind of a petition asking for something concrete in return? And so we see that the question of the mode of presence of the spirit of Confucius, either symbolic for the Jesuit or real for Navarrete. In fact, this question was
Thierry, we lost your audio.
Thierry, we cannot hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So I can continue.
You are still frozen, but we can hear you.
Okay.
Now
Okay.
you're fine.
Okay, good. So, in fact, there is the question about what is the nature of the ritual, but this question it is not a Chinese question, it is a Western question. Also, the problem is that Navarrete focus on the sacrificial offerings of animals, and that includes the meat, the blood, the hair of the pig. But this focus somehow is going to lead Navarrete astray, because the main meaning of the ritual to Confucius, it is not really a focus on the sacrifice of the pig, but it is something about I should say, how to be respectful to Confucius, or what Confucius is important to our way to behave in the world. So the question of the sacrifice of the pig is very not so important. And in fact, today in China, when people practice the sacrifice, they do not include anymore the killing of the pig. They use already prepared pork meat. So today, in fact, also we have a different understanding of religion and religiosity. So perhaps in the past, the Ricci and Brancati, they consider the ritual to Confucius as a civic, as a political, but today perhaps we are more inclined to see it as a religion, as a religiosity. But in contrast to Navarrete, we do not really condemn them, but we are more perhaps appreciative of the religious element in them. So that I would like to now to move to the second discussion about eating vegetarian. So first about the Catholic fasting, we know that in Catholicism, we restrain the time for eating, especially at time of Lent and every Friday and Saturday. So it is based on a time. And it is for a free purpose. The first purpose is the penitence for the sin.
Thierry, we lost the audio.
Again, the audio.
the PowerPoint might be taking up some of the bandwidth.
Unfortunately, we cannot hear you still.
Is it possible to speak, but then take off the PowerPoint for a bit and just Terry can refer to those notes?
Yes.
That might work.
Okay, let's try again. In fact, for example, we have the Council of Braga in 1561, and which is against extreme form of asceticism, and especially about eating vegetarian. And of course, we have the problem of the Qatar in the Middle Age. So the Chinese fasting is a bit different because it is about the abstinence of meat and also other products. But for the Buddhism, it can be either for the entire life, for example, the monks, but for some people, they can choose to do it for a certain period or certain festival. And in Chinese fasting, there are different reasons for fasting. One is economic, because the people are very poor, so they cannot afford. The second is about health. And the most important is about Buddhism.
Terry, we're losing your audio and then your video is freezing up. It might be overtaxed with the PowerPoint projection. Maybe take that down and continue with your video.
I apologize about these difficulties. Thierry is joining us from Guangzhou in China, and it looks like we are having some connectivity problems. I wonder, perhaps while we wait for Thierry, maybe Paul, we could sort of pick up the conversation, Paul, and see whether maybe you can offer some reflections on this question of the Chinese rites. And then, when Thierry comes back, maybe we can sort of continue, more in a sort of conversational way rather than going on with a lecture like that. I apologize for the disruption. Let me just introduce Paul and say a couple of words. Paul is a member of the Society of Jesus and the Edmund Campion S.J. Endowed Professor of History at Santa Clara. He's the author of Church Militant, Bishop Kung and Catholic Resistance in Communist Shanghai, published by Harvard University Press in 2011, which explores church-state conflict in the early years of the People's Republic of China. And he's published widely on this topic. He's currently working on a book on the Shanghai Catholic community in the years after Mao. And I see you're also assisting at the San Jose Chinese Catholic Mission. So Paul, perhaps you can tell us, share your thoughts about this issue, and then maybe Thierry, we can continue as a conversation, given that, let's see, Paul, please.
Okay, great. Yeah, maybe I'll just take a quick in between here, and then Terry, you can get ready again for the second round. But already Terry has raised some really great questions. As many of you know, that this Chinese rites controversy was one of the great debates in the church in all time. And it was a great East-West time of dialogue, maybe disagreement, maybe debate. And it lasted for about 100 years. So it's right up there with the grace and nature debates. What I find fascinating was the Vatican weighed in on different sides at different times. So it was constantly moving target. And I think Thierry has set this up nicely to show that Ricci's method of accommodation really was very open to Confucian. It had anti-Buddhist polemic for sure, but it had a strong pro-Confucian bent to it. And they basically an openness to culture and an openness to Chinese culture that perhaps some of the later missionaries did not quite have. So this got debated back and forth in China, as we see here with Canton, but also in Paris and in Rome and other places. Unfortunately, finally, about 100 years after it started, the Vatican definitively argued against some of these rights that Thierry mentioned. So I'll stop there for now. Thierry, go ahead.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Beautiful.
Yes, I changed, in fact, the place and the connection. So let's try again and sharing also my PowerPoint. Okay. Okay. So I was talking about vegetarian. And so we have a Chinese Christian called Yan Tingyuan. And the Yan Tingyuan has also this, is going, in fact, he had the kind of Buddhist background, but is going to accept the idea of eating, of course, flesh, and is going to reject the Buddhist vegetarian. And he's going to have the argument to say, if God created all this kind of animal species, it is to be eaten. So it is the idea of creation. The creation of God is for the purpose of man, and so man should in fact even eat animal flesh. And also there is an important argument about the ancestor right, because in the ancestor right in China, we have to use meat to present to the ancestor. And so that, again, it is a very old debate in Chinese tradition between kind of conflict with Buddhism. Also, an interesting thing is that Giulio Aleni is a Jesuit who went to a village in Fujian in 1647. In fact, he found people who practiced fasting. And what he's going to do is going, in fact, to baptize all the village without asking them to renounce to their practice of eating vegetarian. And so we see a kind of Christianization of the practice. Yeah. So in the 1668 in Guangzhou, they are going to write articles, and the one relating to fasting is a Chinese faster who have not broken their fast are not to be admitted to baptism except in extraordinary circumstances in which there is no scandal and the right intention for fasting can be proven. So it's the idea that you ask people in some special circumstances to make a kind of say that they practice this eating vegetarian is not for Buddha, but it is for Christ. And so we have, in fact, documents about this controversy, which are still kept in the Roman archive of the Jesuit in Rome. And so especially one by Intercetta, a Sicilian Jesuit, and one by Adrien Grelon, a French Jesuit. So Intercetta is in favor of people getting baptized when they are vegetarian, but Adrien Grelon is opposing that. And so there is a discussion about what is a formal act. It is what is the subjective intention of the people. And Intercetta say people who used to fast for the bad reason, because they fast for Buddha, they can keep their practice if they make it Christian. So they fast for Christ. But Grelon say it is theoretically possible to separate both vegetarianism from superstition, but practically it is impossible. And so you need a radical rupture people have to completely discard their practice. And so there is a discussion on what is the material act, and Intercheta and Grelon both agree that the individual act of eating is morally neutral. But Grelon say vegetarianism is essentially linked to Buddhism. Is a social value of vegetarianism is Buddhist, and so you cannot disconnect that from Buddhism. And so if Catholic do that, they still do a material sin. But Intercheta goes against, and he say that in fact there is not a necessary link between vegetarianism and Buddhism. And he say that in fact in Chinese culture, many literati, many Confucian practice vegetarianism. And so we see that in fact there is this discussion between the formal act and material act. But it is quite inconclusive because it's very difficult to assess the personal intention of the one who fasts, and also the social practice. And so it's very hard to describe and to say it is to be condemnable or to be approved, because so many different meanings in the Chinese society. And in fact, the question also was examined in Rome, but because Rome condemned the Chinese rite, also there was no further allowance for vegetarianism in China. And so the last question, perhaps only a few words, is about wearing a hat. So because in China, to wear a hat is a sign of respect in the past. And so the question was, in 1615, already the Pope had allowed the missionaries to wear a hat during Mass. And in Guangzhou, they asked, is it possible for all the people in the attendance, the faithful, also to wear a hat during Mass? And so here we have a kind of question about the sign, a sign which has opposite meanings. In the West, wearing a hat is a sign of respect. But in China, if you are uncovered, that it is disrespectful. So it is very difficult to harmonize the two things. And so in Guangzhou, they are going first to adopt a kind of very awkward solution. They are going to say, when the faithful receive communion, they should uncover their head. But when they attend the Mass, they should wear a hat. It is to mean that during all the Mass, people they uncover their head is to show respect. But I'm sorry, I mixed up. Is to say that in fact the same meaning of wearing a hat has two connotations here, and so it's a bit strange, in fact. So we may conceive that the same sign has opposite meaning according to different contexts. But in this case, we have a strong unity because it is the same action, the Mass, the same place, the church, the same people. And so it is difficult to imagine that wearing a mask could have opposite meanings. And so this question of the hat become more and more polarized. And later, the majority requests that the Chinese faithful wear the hat during all the Mass, even communion. But the opponents, in fact, push for the hat to be completely abolished, not only for the Chinese Catholic, but also for the priest. So here also we have documents, and here we see the final resolution that every external veneration toward a person, as well as toward the real or believed divinity, is always expressed by Chinese with the head cover. And so the idea is that at the end, they say that everybody should have the hat all the time during the Mass. And so Grelon, in fact, is going to argue opposite, and is going to quote St. Paul, because St. Paul has this idea that the male should uncover their head while praying to God. And also the practice of the Universal Church, the practice in China, and also the practice about confession. But for Grelot also, St. Paul's statement, I have become all things to all, is not absolute, but has a limit, restriction. Otherwise, absurd conclusion should follow, such as missionary have to smoke tobacco or to grow long nail, as the Chinese do. And so Grelot also questioned the universality of the practice of the hat in China, because he found out that the Manchu, in fact, has a different tradition. And so for the Jesuit Ferraris, in fact, he said that external veneration are only convention bound to particular culture. And so he said that that should prevail. We should respect the local culture. And he quotes the Pope Gregory the Great. Do not attach yourself to the custom you saw in the Roman Church, but take from all parts what is conform to the situation and determine from the need of England what could be benefit her more. And so Ferraris explains the reason of the controversy. In fact, he said that the missionaries have a kind of national feeling. They wanted to impose the European culture. Or also there is a mistake of appreciation of Adam Schall, because Adam Schall was in Beijing, and when the Manchu came, he understood that the Manchu do not have the practice of the hat, and so he decided to abolish the hat in Beijing and North China. But that probably was a mistake. And also the failure to properly train missionaries in understanding Chinese culture. But also the problem is that the Chinese faithful are too nice to the missionaries because they do not dare to reject changes when they are imposed by the priest. And so Ferraris is going to argue for maintaining the practice of the hat, and he says that the ethnocentric feeling of the missionary should be abandoned, and that the Catholic liturgy should be more flexible and should allow the hat. So in fact, it's very important because in 1673, in fact, Rome is going to give this authorization for the faithful to attend the Mass with the hat. And so it's going to be continued only until the 19th century. So it is kind of the positive things that are going to remain from the Canton Conference. And so now I move to my conclusion. So when we look at the theology of culture, to understand the relation of Christianity, Christianity should not be seen against the culture, nor above the culture, but through them or within them, because God do not speak directly, but mostly through human mediation, through language, through society, through history. And so there is a need to balance the universality of faith and to preserve the authenticity of Christianity, and also to give a fair importance to sign, symbol, cultural expression. So of course, when I say a fair importance, because it should not be absolutized, nor regarded as unimportant. So we have to strike a balance. So the possibility of adopting local practices like vegetarianism or wearing a hat or allowing ritual to Confucius. So in terms of theology of religion, God is a mystery and it is always present in other religions. So we need to have a kind of attitude of openness, of respect and dialogue. And besides the Christian sculpture, we need to take into account anthropological, cultural, historical, and political dimension to express Christianity. And so besides the Bible. So that is the end of my talk. Thank you very much. I'm going to.
Thierry, thank you very much. I apologize to everyone for the earlier disruption. Now, Paul, we already heard some of your thoughts, but I'm sure you have more to contribute at this point. I'd like to invite the audience, by the way, to send in questions. You have a Q&A function at the bottom of the page, and we are going to try and sort of raise some of these questions in the last 10 to 15 minutes. So please, I encourage you to submit your own question. But Paul, you can resume now. And now we cannot hear you, Paul.
There we go. Unmute on my new MacBook here. Very good. Thierry, excellent. In fact, I think the audience really should know that I wrote a book review for Thierry's book some year ago, and I said he was basically a latter-day Matteo Ricci himself.
No.
He's there he's in Canton itself. So I have a couple quick questions I'd just like to throw out. First of all, Canton Conference, you're there in Guangzhou and Canton itself. Has this informed your thinking, or have you found sources on the ground there, or have you been to any of these sites, maybe, if we know where they were?
Yes, thank you, Paul. In fact, yes, I did a lot of, a kind of research, local, and so I tried to locate, for example, the churches, where the churches of the Jesuit, because you have all those 25 missionaries, they were packed into the Jesuit church and the Jesuit residence of Guangzhou. So looking at the maps of China, of Canton in the Ming Dynasty, I'm quite able to find out the place, things like that. And so we are looking also at the archives about, the imperial archives. And so we can find also some local documents, but I should say that most of my research is still based on the Roman archive in Rome, with, mostly the text in Latin or other languages. Yeah.
One small personal note, I caught the attention here that they were all kind of under house arrest or together in one house, both Dominican, I guess, and Jesuit. And I'm wondering if you wrote some of these papers or ideas during our own quarantine, where many of us have been kind of cooped up at home, and finding maybe we can get it, if we're following our better spirits, we can get a little bit more academic work done without all of the distractions of the outside world. Did you find the same?
Yeah, yes. In fact, it is this kind of house arrest was a blessing, because you had the 25 people during 5 years, and so they could not go much outside of that residence, and so they debate. So of course, the bad thing in debate, sometimes things get a bit passionate, and so they go to extreme position. But it forced them to read the Chinese text, to do translation, and to write many things. So we have a lot of sinological production which has been made here in Guangzhou because of the blessing of this house arrest.
I was also very interested in the papers that you sent me that you based the presentation on. Maybe you could say a word or two about the actual sources and how the discussions took place, but then they would go to Rome and codify them into sort of a book. And what exists today? Are they the original documents, or are they transcripts, or what? But I found some of that interesting. If you could talk about do a deeper dive into you had a couple key sources where these things were all written down.
Yes, thank you for that question. In fact, because there was a formal conference which was made between all the missionaries for 1 month, 1 month and a half. But also after that, there were also different discussions. So what happened is that all the documents were written in Guangzhou and were approved by the local superior and signed by all the missionaries, including the Jesuit, the Dominican, and the Franciscan, and they were sent to Macau. And so in Macau, it was because in the hand of what we call the visitor. Usually, it was a Portuguese, da Gama. And so da Gama will collect those documents and will make 5 copies of each document. And so the 5 copies were sent by boat from Macau through a different road, a different maritime road or different boats. And so we have in the document in Rome, we have prima via, secunda via, and the first road, second road, the 5th road. And so what is very nice is that in some of the documents, we have 5 of them which are still present today in the Roman archive in the same file. But some other documents, perhaps we may have only 2 or 3 copies. And so our copies are sometimes from different handwritings. So it is nice to compare the different copies to find probably there have been some difficulties, but for me it is quite nice to see different handwritings, because sometimes it is difficult to read the documents in Portuguese or Latin, and so I can get a better understanding of the wording of the document.
So the richness of the resources, both in Rome. Rome has a great Chinese collection and Chinese documents, but also Western documents relating to China. And then also there in China, the Chinese have been great recording their own history. And you mentioned that with some of the Ming Dynasty texts. So a question I get sometimes or think about when I teach about the Chinese rights controversy is the $1 million question was, if the Vatican had been more open perhaps to the accommodationist approach, would China be Christian today? I'm sure you've heard that before.
Yeah. Yes, perhaps there was probably a window of opportunity, and that the right controversy had very bad consequences, because the Kangxi emperor was very in favor of the Christian mission. But when Rome decided to forbid the right of Confucius and the ancestor, so Kangxi emperor somehow retracted, and so he limited, restricted. It means that all the missionary, we had to get a kind of permit and to be allowed to be in China, and the people who do not respect, they have to leave, things like that. And the problem is also his successor, Emperor Yongzheng, also enforced a very strict ban on Christianity. So probably, I believe you are right that if there was not this decision of Rome to forbid the Chinese rite, probably the history would have been very, very different.
Can I ask, what did you find most interesting in terms of diversity? So on the one hand, you're trying to look at specific issues, wearing of the hat or vegetarianism, and yet in some ways it's a moving target in that we have the Confucian rites, in a sense, blessing the meat. And then we also have groups of vegetarians. So like in the missionary side, there's a diversity of opinion, but in China, there's a lot of diversity as well.
Yeah, yes, it's true. So is that the difficulty of the controversy, because for example, the right ritual to Confucius is interpreted in a very different way if it is done by a literati, which considers the ritual as a kind of expression of kind of political allegiance or cultural things. But when it is done by some perhaps common people, probably they have a different understanding of the ritual, and perhaps they even will beg for things from ancestor. They will ask from ancestor protection or wealth, success, things like that. And so that will become a bit tricky, because in Christianity, in fact, you cannot have a petition only to God, but also to the saints. But the saints are the saints approved by the Catholic Church. And so so that makes the question you ask is very important, is that those rituals are understood in very different ways by the people in China.
And I also like the fact that in your presentation, to some extent, some of the judgments and such were almost unresolvable. The questions were pitched in Western terms. The Chinese had not really thought in those categories. And, what really separates a religious act, even said anthropologists today would look at this and say, yes, they are religious rites, right? But in another reading, no, they're civil. So that's kind of the crux of the Chinese rites controversy, isn't it? Kind of trying to separate those two things out and whether it can be done. Yeah.
And yes, and they, of course, at that time they apply those categories of what is a legitimate ritual and what is something illegitimate. And the question also is that our concept of religion also has changed from the time of Ricci to now. The concept of religion has completely changed, especially because in the 19th century we have the constitution of what we call religious studies and the concept of religion. And until today, I mean, in 21st century, our understanding of religion is changing. So we use the same word, and but in fact the word have always different meanings.
This is jumping far ahead from your paper, but technically the Chinese rites were finally approved in 1940s.
Yes,
What
correct.
led, maybe just a word on what led to that new assessment? Oh, if you, if possible.
Yes, probably I think you are a better expert than myself, but I could say only my understanding, I think, is that at that time, the decision by Rome to approve the rituals of Confucius was mostly a kind of political decision, because this idea, it was an expression of that those rituals were expressing the national identity of China. So Vatican wanted to have to get closer politically, I mean, or to show respect to the political constitution of China. So somehow they approved those rituals, but I think it was not on a theological ground, mostly on political ground, if I am correct. Probably you know better than me.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. The times had changed. It was more, I think it even started with Japan.
Yeah, yes, correct.
Yeah, so in World War II. So by that point, I think they had to kind of figure a better way to deal with it. Let's do this. Let's go over to Thomas. I see there's a handful of questions, and then if I need to loop back in, we'll do that. But you didn't all come to hear me speak, so there's some questions. Go ahead.
Yes, we have a few questions. Actually, we have an observation more than a question in the chat by Li Jinhyun. I think you actually addressed this point already, Thierry, somewhat, because this comment points out that we should perhaps remember that there are multidimensional elements in the Chinese rites. The differences between elites, literati in Beijing, and ordinary people in local provinces that included Buddhist elements, Taoist elements, shamanistic elements, etc. And going on down, it also comments on the difference between the rites of the neo-Confucian elites, less idolatrous, and the rites of ordinary people. I mean, obviously, there is this distinction between, so popular religion and elite religion. Is it useful to even draw this distinction in China? Can we input this distinction at all? Or, there is this whole controversy in Taoism, whether you can talk about elite Taoism and popular Taoism, and some people question this.
Yeah, yes. So in fact, in China, there has been a term which has been used to describe a religion as a diffused religion. So diffused religion, to say that is not like in the West, where you have a kind of a strong organization like a church, but the idea of a diffused religion is to say that you have a different degree of belongings. It is not such a strong membership as it is in the Catholic Church, but it is more diffused, where people will go to perform some rituals to a Buddhist temple, but will go also to the Taoist temple, will go to the church. So that makes things more difficult to. But of course, when I say that, in fact, we have to recognize that today China has changed a lot. And so perhaps this idea of a diffuse religion was very much important in the traditional society, but perhaps is less relevant today, because today people will get perhaps more kind of clear identity, especially, I mean, for example, the Chinese Christian, they will say, oh, I am Christian, so I will never go to a temple, and so we have today perhaps a different meaning also of what is a religious identity.
Yeah, because you always hear this, idea that the notion of multiple religious belonging, that is sort of a very sort of contemporary thing in the West. In a way, in China was actually always sort of part of the religious landscape, because people would not necessarily consider themselves as either Taoist or Buddhist or Confucian, but they would actually practice each one of these different traditions according to a particular context, so that was always the case, right? But then, Christianity arrives, and then it brings a completely different set of categories that are not very easily reconcilable with this vision. But yeah, anyway, let's go to another one of the questions. You see, Thomas Croteau, who actually sent like 3 questions, but let me start with the first one. Concerning the Chinese rites controversy, did the defenders appeal to the defense of sacred image veneration in Europe, such as incensing a statue of Mary is not idolatry? Did anybody actually talk about that?
Yes, of course. I mean, they will consider, of course, the missionaries. They will never consider that as idolatry, because, and in fact, it is because in the 16th century we have, I mean, the Protestantism, which is going to somehow to downgrade or even to attack the worship of saint. Or to the, I'm not sure, should not say worship, but I should say the veneration of saints, veneration of saints. So because of that, we have in reaction, in fact, in Europe, people wanted to emphasize, in fact, the role of Mary, the role of saints, but at the same time, of course, they still take into account the criticism of Martin Luther, all of that. And so we have a kind of evolution of the Catholic discourse on the veneration of saints. But in China, I think it's very important when Matteo Ricci come to China. In fact, he wants immediately to introduce also the veneration to Mary, the veneration to the saints. So that, because that is part of the Catholic identity, and so for them, they will never think that it is a superstition.
Oh yeah, and of course, you know, I mean, I have perhaps read more about India than about China, but you see a very similar phenomenon with missionaries to India, you know, who sort of condemn idolatrous practices, but of course want to introduce, you know, the veneration to the Virgin Mary. I mean, you see this in, you know, in Tamil Nadu, for instance, etc. But another question from Tom Croteau is about hats. You know, he's saying, concerning the hat, did the debate mention the wearing and progressive removal of a bishop's head coverings during Mass leading to communion? Well, I mean, I guess priests would wear hats and birrettas, especially in the past, you know, and I mean, did that really have any relevance at all? And
yeah. So in fact, in mainland China, there was no bishop. I think the first bishop really was in Macau, and after, of course, the first was Wenzhou, but that it was. Yes, it was at the same time. It's interesting. At the same, at that time, we had a Chinese bishop during the Canton Conference. He was not staying in Guangzhou, though. He was moving around. But I think that for the hat of the bishop is not so important. The question mostly is how to because there was only one bishop, so I think it was not so important. But the problem is for the Catholic assembly, when you have so many faithful attending mass, if you have half of the assembly with a hat, half of the assembly without a hat, it makes it disrupts the harmony of the aesthetic of the liturgy somehow. So there is the idea that you should have a uniform practice, perhaps not across China, but at least in one assembly, everybody has to wear a hat to show respect, or nobody wear a hat. So that will be the question for the assembly to decide.
Yeah, but now I'm going to ask you a question. But what about women? I mean, was there an idea that women would have to wear a veil or a head covering, or something? I mean, do you have any discussion about that at all? Because I mean, in the West, you always had this idea that, I mean, in Europe, you know, women had to wear a head covering. I mean, even until the 1960s, this used to be very, like, almost like, I think it was required. Now, not really, but, you know, do you have any conversation about that in China at all, or nobody seems to address this?
In the document I have read, unfortunately, they do not discuss about the woman, but I still believe, yes, that probably they had to wear a kind of veil, but I'm not really sure about that question because it is not really mentioned in the document.
Yes, it's very interesting. It's maybe because, I mean, but women would also attend mass, right? So then,
yeah. But in fact, in China at that time, they want to have a segregation of women and male. So, of course, in most cases, probably there will be on one side there will be the male, on one other side the woman. But you have also some churches in China. They are going to be built with two doors. So you have Yes, so you have one gate for the male, one gate for the woman, and they do not really cross into each other, and only the common point will be the choir. So they will, the priest will be in the middle, and so it can be seen by the two parts of the assembly, but they don't really mix. But that is a kind of a bit unusual architectural church design, but it existed.
Okay. Okay, so yeah, and Tom Croteau also, in fact, mentions, where he's asking whether there were different, the Chinese rites customs varied from region to region. But I think you already addressed that, certainly there were regional variations, correct, and so maybe we can move to the next question by Shengping Guo, who asks, well, according to your conclusions, God speaks through people with other cultures and religions, and what kind of intercultural theology do we need to develop in today's post-colonial time? My goodness, that's such a very vast question. We could talk about this for about 2 or 3 hours.
Yes, I think the culture is always evolving. So in the 21st century, we pay different attention. For example, the role of women in our culture, the role of women in society, in the church. So it's something that we have to tackle, or the place of I don't know, the media culture and all the digital, the Zoom culture. I mean, these kind of things. How that also is going to be incorporated also into our understanding of God, of Christ. So the culture is always moving, and we have it. I mean, there is always a very rich potential for the church to understand the contemporary culture, contemporary art, and to try to draw that and to find its connection and the presence of Christ already present in this new culture.
Yeah, thank you. This is all very interesting. Now, let me ask you a question. What is the status of Confucian ritual today in China? Are there, are these Confucian rituals practiced at all very much, or not really?
Yeah, yes, so I should say the ritual to Confucius itself are not very well practiced. Only in a few places in China you will have this kind of rituals, but it's not. But what is more important still, it is the ritual to ancestor. So in fact, of course, in many places in Taiwan and Hong Kong, they still preserve in the family house. We have what we call the pai wei, and so that you have a kind of a domestic altar where we put the tablet of the ancestor, and you have also a picture, thing like that. So that is very traditional in Hong Kong and Taiwan. In mainland China, not as much, but still in the villages, you have still the idea of having the place, the burial grounds of the family. And so the people, especially for, I mean, 2 weeks ago, we had the festival of Qimingjie. And so the people go back to their hometown to especially in South China. It is very important in the region of Guangdong, Fujian is very much alive. You go back to your hometown to perform sacrifices. I mean, to do offerings into the grave of your ancestor.
Okay. I think Aaron wanted to jump in and say something. Am I correct?
Is my video working?
I thought, Aaron, you wanted to jump in and comment on one of the questions.
Oh, no, sorry, no.
I thought I maybe misunderstood something that you said. So, Paul, you have anything to add? We have a few more minutes.
Sure, just a question.
We have actually almost 10 more minutes, so you can ask any other questions if you wish. Yes.
It's always interesting to kind of bounce these things off the current day, as Thomas just did. And I was remembering more or less, I think I grew up in an age where maybe practice or Catholic practice might have been downplayed after a very devotional age. And here we're seeing how important practice really is. I mean, you have these very deep philosophical debates among the missionaries, and yet it kind of boils down to, can you wear a hat or not? Can you be vegetarian or not? So maybe a comment on just the practicalities of their debating, I mean, I guess if I had a Chinese student come to me and interested in becoming a Catholic, And it was often about practice, right? It was often, what can I do? What can I do? Maybe a word about that, about the practice, and the missionaries kind of debating this out, a couple hundred years ago, but they are a very practical questions about clothing and about food.
Yes. I think it is correct. I mean, for in Chinese culture, people are looking for also a kind of a way of life. And so I think we have to understand the Christianity in China also as people commit to a way of life, a Christian way of life, and like that goes with a very personal and collective practices. And because I think, especially in China today, especially the young people, they feel a bit at loss. They feel that of course, there is a kind of ideology about the progress of the country, everything is good, but that does not really answer their personal question and their personal desire for a more concrete way of life, which is more based on community, which is also open to transcendence, and so I think many people in China today, they still want to look at Christianity as a way of life, to find a group, a community. And so I think it's also why, I mean, today in China, we have what we call the Jiating Jiaohui, the family church is growing so strongly in China also, because really the young people in China, they need these kind of things, and that cannot be provided by the state or by the society of consumerism.
Maybe just a word too about, I'm fascinated, these missionaries, Dominican and Jesuit, together under house arrest for 4 or 5 years. I mean, did you find out anything how they got along, or I mean, any anecdotes or vignettes about their lives there in that particular period? Because it's kind of towards the end of the arc of the Chinese rights controversy, and yet you're doing some great work, but are they permitted to leave the house at that time?
So in fact, when they arrive in the house, for the first few months or 1 year, they could not really leave the house. But still, there was 1 or 2 Jesuits who were more local. I mean, Italian, but serving the local community. So they will more and more go out, and also because at that time there was. In Beijing, there was evolution in the political scene, is that the Kangxi emperor was taking hold of the power, and was rehabilitating, kind of rehabilitation of Adam Schall, who had already died, but getting more closer to Ferdinand Verbist. And so this kind of things, it was of course progressive, and little by little, I mean, the local government in Guangdong also allow more and more freedom. But the relation about the missionaries is very interesting, because we see in so many debates, sometimes we see that the kind of the people take a stand. It is not necessarily according to their religious congregation or nationality. For example, on the question of the hat, some people are against, are opposed, but there will be a different split when we talk about eating or not vegetarian. So, of course, I'm talking about individual cases, but still, we can still find that a more solid group of people are more progressive and other more conservative. But of course, there will be also personal animosities between the people. For example, at Navarrete also was very strong character, and because he was so forward into opposing the Chinese rights, something like that. And so there were many bad feelings among them. And so it's why when Navarrete escaped from Guangzhou and went to Madrid, he published this book, which is a very important book, and which was also related to the right controversy and very influential.
Yeah, maybe, I know we're running towards the end, but maybe just could you give us just a little brief note about maybe more personally about some of your work there, because your presentation obviously shows, command of the original sources, basically ancient Chinese, also the Latin, the European languages, and your work there with graduate students on kind of shepherding them through the process of not only learning more about the Christian sources, but about the original languages.
Yeah, yes, this is true, but I'm not working alone. I have the chance to be in that university at Yat-sen, and so we have established a center for the relation between the cultural exchange between China and the West. And so we have PhD students and master degree students who are doing this kind of research. And so, of course, what we have to do, we have to learn Latin. So they spend a couple of years to learn Latin, kind of to get some basis. And of course, to work on the documents, so to transcribe those documents from Latin into today modern script, to do translation work from Latin into Chinese, but also we are working on the Chinese text, and the Chinese text also, which have we have those ancient books, and we have also a team of people who are also doing a punctuated text to try to take those texts and to add a punctuation to do modern edition of the Chinese text written by the missionaries.
Yeah, very good.
Thierry, that's excellent. Unfortunately, we need to bring this conversation to a close, but I really want to thank you for your insight and your contribution and your work, and of course, Paul, also for your questions and for your comments. And perhaps we'll have other occasions to continue this conversation. I will now hand everything over again to Aaron to just conclude. Thank you.
Yeah, all I really want to say is to echo Thomas's thank you to Thierry and to Paul, and also I also want to thank Thomas again for the whole series. Really kind of came out of his ideas and his work, so I want to thank him for that. So thank you again, Thierry. Thank you, Paul, and thank you all for being here. And hopefully, as Thomas said, we can continue these conversations at Santa Clara for in the future. And so it was a wonderful talk, a wonderful conversation, and we're very lucky we were able to end on this note and the great work of Thierry. So thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. 再见.
Good day. So.